Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. And in this episode, we're going to talk about our key tips for how to store estate planning documents. And Justin, like we were talking about before we hit record, there's a lot of nuance to this. This is a best practice that a lot of us don't follow. You know, I'll be honest and say myself included, I need to, after this episode is over, make sure that I have all of the boxes checked in terms of what we're going to talk about today. And so we're going to give some general guidance around estate planning documents. And of course, before we go into this, understand this is being shared for informational purposes only. This shouldn't be construed as financial, legal, or any other type of advice, but it's just sort of best practices that we've gleaned after talking to people, attorneys, guests on the show, reading articles, and we just wanted to distill that down into a concise episode that you could use to help guide your estate planning and make sure that your heirs aren't surprised when you're gone.
You said it, Matt. And to set the stage for why we talk about this a lot, this is the number one reason we hear from people. And it's innocent. You know, their ancestors, it wasn't something they were thinking about. When you get to the end of your life, it is not a primary concern. But folks inherit minerals and they really have absolutely no idea what to do or even that it was owned at all. And having that document storage, communicating a plan to somebody is really that first step. And there is some part to them that it's up to them to learn about it or not. But if you can't find it, it makes it really tricky.
Yeah, that's a great point. And most of the clients that I work with that have inherited minerals, they found out about it when a landman reached out to them to lease the minerals or to make a purchase offer. And a lot of times that was the first time that they learned that they actually had inherited minerals and royalties. And so certainly we don't want that for our heirs. We want to make sure our heirs are well informed. Like you mentioned, Justin, whether or not they choose to take on the role of actively managing these assets or hiring a mineral manager or an accountant or somebody to do it for them, that's up to them, right? So that at least you give them the choice of saying, okay, here's what you own, and making your instructions very clear, because that's the other thing is maybe your grandfather that you inherited minerals from wanted to keep those in the family, but because it wasn't included in the will, those wishes were never communicated on paper and never communicated verbally to a family member. Nobody knew about that. And so when they inherited them, it's like, well, I don't really want to deal with this. This is a nice chunk of change. I'm going to go ahead and sell them. You know, so if you want to have your wishes followed when you're gone, you got to communicate it.
Yep, you said it, Matt. And you have to have it, stored somewhere. So that picture, again, we hear about that all too often. And the first step is knowing what documents you really should be gathering. You know, things that you hear about commonly, your last will and testament, trust documents, if you have trust documents, healthcare directives, powers of attorneys, life insurance policies, and then the list of assets and liabilities, which this is all standard stuff we hear about all the time. But with minerals, it becomes even more important because it's such a unique asset type that requires those deeds. It requires to know your ownership percentage. So for mineral rights and royalty owners, you also need to have division orders, original recorded deeds and conveyance documents, overriding royalty interest assignments, oil and gas leases, hopefully the final signed versions of those, current and historical revenue statements, tax documents. Those would be the 1099s from the operators for royalties, and lease bonus payments. And then any kind of inheritance documentation if you received the interest through an estate. And Matt, that's in my case. It's not only my parents' estate that we deal with, but it's the estate of an ancestor 2 or 3 generations down. And so those documents are still important.
Yeah, those documents are very important, and teaching your family members and showing them where to find them, because you don't want them in a moment of grief and dealing with the loss that they're having to frantically search through boxes, desk drawers, trying to find these estate documents, trying to find a copy of your will, any trust documents. I know that you have a really interesting story from somebody recently where they went through probate, but then it turns out they actually discovered a trust document later on. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this specific scenario, it wasn't related to mineral rights as far as they're aware, but exactly as you said, Matt, they went through probate with their parents. There were a bunch of real estate properties that were not known about. And then later on, it was found that there was actually a trust in their home, but the kids weren't told about it. And what do you do then? It makes more cost, which I'm sure probate wasn't inexpensive to start with.
Yeah, that probate expense could have been almost entirely avoided, I imagine, if the trust was properly funded and all those properties were in the trust, and that trust document becomes really important in determining, what you want to do with those assets when you're gone. And so that really will dictate who gets what from the standpoint of hopefully not having to have your heirs try to figure it out or have the state, worst of all, because oftentimes the laws of intestate succession, in other words, if you don't have a will, may go contrary to your wishes. If if your heirs can't find the will, it really does you no good of even having it, right? Because then they're not going to go through the process of actually following it, right? So, Justin, you mentioned a really important list of core estate planning documents. I'm going to put together a download. So if you listen to this and want to get a really comprehensive checklist of those documents, to sort of a cheat sheet to follow for your estate planning documents, go to the show notes for this episode, and then there'll be a link there where you can download that. But Justin, there's different ways to store these types of documents. Do you want to talk a little bit about what type of documents we might need to have access to quickly in an emergency? And, I think it's important to remember that you should try to keep these documents in a fireproof and waterproof safe in your home, in a secure location, hidden, or, in a place that you kind of, you know where it is, or that it can be maybe not so obviously found, but then also that it's going to withstand a natural disaster like we saw in California right now. And our hearts go out to those that are affected by those wildfires in California and the LA area. But that came up so quickly, Justin, and those types of incidents can happen. And if you're not prepared and don't have those documents in a secure location, then they can be lost. So that is the first thing. But Justin, do you want to talk about the documents we might need to access quickly in the case of an emergency, or just in general, the things that maybe don't need to be put in long-term storage or secure storage, but like things that we might need in a somewhat easily accessible manner?
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. So some of the things that you should really keep, and best practice is to keep these in your home in a safe or somewhere that your family knows they're there. But healthcare directives, powers of attorneys, insurance information, a master list of asset locations. This could be either with your trust documents as the inventory of your estate, or even a separate list of those. And then you could keep other information like other revenue statements that you have coming in that are recent. And that might be optional. But if you have a payment coming in that's rather large and you want your family to know about that, having that revenue statement right there and handy would be a great thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, definitely I would say, having that insurance information, those healthcare directives, powers of attorney, those are things that you might need in a short time period. Certainly if you get an unexpected health issue, you might need to have those healthcare directives very easily accessible, powers of attorney, things like that, to make sure that your family can follow your wishes in terms of those things. So that's what let's call tier one, that immediate access. And again, that should be kept in your house or somewhere, one of your properties, in a fireproof and waterproof safe that your family members have the key to, or know the password or the code to get in it. That's the key thing. It's one thing to have it in the safe, but if they can't access it, it doesn't really do them any good or you any good. So that's the first step. The second step is what I'll call secure long-term storage, right? So this is for those original documents that you need maximum security, but they maybe aren't going to be needed immediately in an emergency. And this would be things really tied to your estate, the state documents being wills, trust documents, copies of deeds to your properties that you currently own, any mineral rights documentation. Like Justin said, this would probably include a master list of those mineral interests in terms of the legal description. So I would definitely be careful in tying it to wells or operators, because those may come and go. But if you own mineral rights, those are perpetual, generally speaking, depending on the state, obviously. But in general, and they're tied to the legal description. So you need to have the legal description of all those mineral interests. And then with the property deeds, that would be like property, like if you had a second home or your primary residence, and then any original recorded conveyance documents related to your minerals and royalties, whether that's things like if you own overriding royalty interest, that would be an assignment document or a lease, or it could be for minerals, just a mineral deed, quick claim deed, those types of things. So for those original documents, your will, those trust documents, it's really important, like Justin mentioned earlier with that example, that your family knows where those are located and how to access them. And so this could be something where it's a bank safe deposit box. And you got to make sure, though, you have the paperwork in that tier 1 storage to allow the executor of your estate to get access to those safe deposit box so they can give that to the bank, because that is a nuance with safe deposit boxes. Great from the standpoint of security, but then that may mean it's difficult for those that need to get access to actually get access to it. And then, write that all down, right? Here's the instructions for, I have a safe deposit box at this location, and then here's the document that grants this person access to go and fetch those documents that are needed to actually follow your wishes in terms of your estate plans. And so that, writing that down for those younger generations, I think is important as well. So having those instructions written down and, again, communicating that to the current generation that is going to inherit your interests. And another place for this, and Justin, we were talking before we hit record, that back in the day, a lot of families had a family attorney, right, that maybe they had that helped them start their business, that did all the legal paperwork, or accountant or CPA that would kind of be an extension of their business, and they would help out with these types of things and have copies of these documents on behalf of the family. Maybe it's a little bit less common today, but certainly could be arranged. I think if you had a law firm that is willing to do that, then that's definitely another option, and then again, communicating the name of the attorney and the firm and their contact information so that your heirs know where to go to get that information, I think is really key. Wherever you store it, make sure whoever the executive of your estate is, that they know where to go to get that information, I think is the key point. Justin, anything else to add on that tier 2 storage?
I think you nailed it, Matt. That's really, having those instructions. I think I've got a 2-year-old going on 3 now, and the chances of her ever touching a safety deposit box are very, very slim. And so writing clear instructions for her to understand, you're going to go to the bank, you're going to take this key with you, you're going to tell the bank why you're there, they're going to go in with you, would be comforting to her as she kind of tackles a situation that maybe she's never encountered before. And I think this goes for a lot of the instructions. I know, Matt, when I got into this, I was just trying to connect the dots to what documents did I need? Who do I need to talk to? Where do I need to go? And so those are all really important things. And Matt, that goes to the tier 3 backup, which is the most modern option here, but I know this is probably the primary way that I use it. And that's a digital backup system. And that can have all the documents you receive. I've got in the habit of any document I receive, even emails with operators, I'll save those, store those in digital storage, and then have a backup of those. And those can be scanned copies of any and all documents and emails, that digital inventory of assets. Perhaps nowadays it's logins to like Mineral IQ, Energy Link, other things like that. It could be password protected cloud storage. It could be local storage. One of the advantages nowadays with cloud storage is most of the major providers offer a way to set up legacy contacts. And so that's a nice feature in a situation like this, where perhaps in your long-term storage or even your immediate access storage, you have the information for them to be able to access your cloud storage as a legacy contact. Matt, some people might be more comfortable with using an encrypted flash drive. That's a great option, or even an encrypted local backup, as long as they could access your computer.
Yeah, that's key. And I think that's another important step, is communicating the password or the login information to be able to access that encrypted storage. So, for example, if you have Microsoft OneDrive, there's a personal vault, which is an encrypted storage within the OneDrive cloud storage that you have. So it's tied to your computer. It's encrypted on your computer, encrypted on OneDrive. And that's important for those personal document, for financial information. You want to keep it secure, but your heirs need to be able to actually get in and access those files or those accounts. And so if you use a password manager, for example, communicating to your heirs, hey, here's the master password to my password manager, and here's how you can get into that. If you have two-factor authentication, here's where you can find that information. So all of this in the digital age becomes a little bit more tricky around getting access to your online life, right? Your financial accounts, whether that's bank accounts, brokerage accounts, retirement, things like that, as well as, like Justin mentioned, for mineral rights. If you have a mineral management software that you use, if it's a cloud system, if it's like Mineralware, MineralSoft, or Mineral IQ, those types of things, that you have passwords if you don't have a mineral manager, or if you do, that again, you put all this in your estate plan, that all these assets here on this list are managed by this person or this firm, and here is the primary contact for my account, and here's who you can contact to help out with this. And so that's the key thing, is scanned copies of these documents are important. The great thing is they will, if it's on the cloud, if your house gets burned down in the fire, even with a fireproof safe, all those documents get destroyed. If you have electronic copies stored in the cloud, again, that are encrypted and that your heirs know how to get access to, that can be a great way to withstand a natural disaster, right? Or withstand some event that those documents are lost, or they were in a box at the bottom underneath a bunch of old bank statements or something that they didn't even know were there. Obviously the communication part is key, but then having an electronic copy. And, there are systems like Justin mentioned that you can use that have the legacy contact information. And some of that could trigger communication to your heirs so that they know where things are stored. And then there's information on how to find out how to get access to them. So all of that's important. So again, just to recap those three tiers, there's the immediate access stuff, which again, this is like healthcare directives, powers of attorney, trust documents. Then there's the secure long-term storage, which is the originals of all of those things, including your will. And again, that's a safe deposit box, or an attorney would be a good place to store those. Digital backup is sort of the third tier. So you want to avoid single points of failure. If something happens to those originals, or your heirs can't access them, they have digital backups that they can get access to. And so that's, I would say, the three steps as far as storing those documents. Now, as far as special considerations for mineral and royalty owners, Justin, let's dive in a little bit deeper to that, because there are some nuances here we want to make sure we cover.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And up and above typical estate issues, there can be valuable leasing occurring if this documentation isn't properly handled, both after the closing of the estate, or even if they're unaware, they could really miss out on some valuable opportunities. And in certain states where there's dormant mineral statutes, that's something that could absolutely create issues, especially if they don't realize they have ownership of the property. It can be a real struggle to prove the ownership. I know when I contacted operators, they begin to ask you for paperwork, and finding that paperwork can be difficult. It can also be expensive to get originals of that recorded documentation from the counties that you need it from. If they choose to sell the interest, they're faced with a lot of the same challenges of having to pull documents and prove ownership. And then again, those dormant mineral statutes can really cause problems if it goes for many years and they're not even aware that they own this. And Matt, creating that detailed inventory of all mineral interest is really important, but for one facet specifically, and that's that, what about properties that aren't currently producing? I think most often we hear about this come up when somebody is notified down the line of a producing property. But I know in my situation, all the producing properties are kind of a big question mark. There's a lot of cost involved in having landman do the research. I don't know what might or might not be out there. And to have that information ready for somebody, legal descriptions, if there was a current operator or the last operator, are these producing? Which ones are not producing? Maybe historical revenue data, especially lease terms and expiration dates. And then if you have a group of trusted advisors, pass that information on. That is something that could really help them to be able to learn. And then we talk all the time, Matt, about NARO, the National Association of Royalty Owners, other places that you can learn about minerals. Where can they go to figure out what this is and how to deal with it, especially if this is new to them?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first place, of course, is to give them the link to this podcast. But then, yeah, like Justin mentioned, a membership to narrow. And I think this is another way that you can be proactive, is to identify in the next generation or the generation after that, who's going to be interested in helping to manage these assets for the family and helping to educate them while you're still alive. I've heard of many stories of our narrow members that have brought their kids or grandkids to various in-person conventions or webinars, and just to help to educate them about these types of assets and how to manage them, to the extent they're interested in wanting to take that role on. And again, that's conversations that you can have while you're still around, that, hey, our family, we own these mineral interests. I'd really love them to stay in the family. Are you interested in helping to manage them? And, you can kind of sense who might be or who might not, and have those conversations to invite them along, and it can be a great bonding event. You go to take a vacation with your grandkid to a fun location, and then there's some education along the way, but then you get to spend some quality time with them. And I think they would appreciate that as well. So those types of things I think can be valuable and are kind of above and beyond all of this, is to help educate them so that when they get the reins, you've done all these steps that we've talked about today on how they can access this information. Everything's put in a trust, let's say, or an LLC, so they don't have to go through probate and the expense and time consuming aspect of that. It's all ready to hit the ground running when they take it over. And again, this is especially important if you own interest in multiple states. And we definitely recommend listening to episode 85, where we interviewed attorney Richard Winblad, and he talked a little bit about probate and marketable title. And there's some very famous people that have been mineral owners in the past. I think there was Bing Crosby, if I remember correctly. Justin was one of those that he mentioned in that episode, that had minerals in Oklahoma that the family had no idea that they even owned them. They weren't included in the estate documents or anything like that. So they had to go through probate and all of those things. But, certainly it does not discriminate in terms of rich versus poor in terms of those assets and handling them correctly. It just requires a little bit of work and making sure that everybody knows what they might stand to inherit. So you don't want to put your heirs in the position where they find out about non-producing minerals when a landman approaches them about leasing or purchasing them, and that's the first time that they find out about it. And that all can be easily avoided by following some of these steps that we are talking about today.
You said it, man. And, one of the important things I think is don't forget to update this. I think we all fall victim to just living life, and it's easy to forget about changes in properties that you own and how that might relate to your estate. And Matt, like you talked about with Richard Winblad, people get into a lot of trouble because they create these trusts. They go through the estate planning process, which has a major cost tied to it a lot of times. However, funding your trust is absolutely critical. You can have that trust created. However, if you don't title the properties into the trust, you really end up not avoiding a lot of the issues. There are some exceptions to that, but the best practice is to fund those properties into your trust. And that's something that you should regularly look at. I know for me, when I'm going through tax season, this is the time that I look at all my documents and I try to organize them and make sure I do have copies of everything I need, both digitally and physically, and keep it top of mind. It's not something we want to think about every day, but once a year is a great time to look at this, see if your organization is still there, if you're missing any documents, and then are there any changes to make to your estate plan?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think having a calendar reminder is the best practice that you set in your calendar, whatever time of year that is, whether it's this time of year as you're going through and touching those documents for tax purposes, you're going through all your records and organizing it for your CPA, might be a good time to update the inventory of your mineral interest. If you've acquired additional interests or you've divested some of those interests, that you want to update that inventory so that it's up to date. And similarly with the inventory of your other assets, the real property and the physical things like the personal property, right? So that's, investments and accounts and all those things that if you've consolidated and you have, you don't have those accounts anymore, you want to take them off the list, right? And if you've opened a new account, add it to the list. So those types of things are important to keep up to date. And then, there's some additional things, I would call this like extra credit. If you go through the process of doing an inventory for insurance purposes, which this California fire sort of triggered in my mind, that may be a good idea to update. But going through and documenting, here's all the things that are in the house. And then, if there's certain heirlooms or things like that you want certain heirs to get, then, or family pictures, things like this. We've been talking about legal documents, but there's the things that can never be replaced, right? If you had to leave in a fire, what would you take? And I heard somebody in this California fire that they would take their family pictures because those are not replaceable. You can replace the flat screen TV, you can replace the computer, generally speaking, as long as you have cloud backups and things like that. So it's the things that you would never be able to replace, pictures of your parents or your grandparents that are on film, or not something that's a digital picture that's stored in the cloud. So that's another thing to think about is, how do you store some of those priceless heirlooms, family legacy, like those family stories that if those have been documented somewhere, your genealogy, that research that your heirs or that your ancestors have put into documenting where you all came from. Some of that stuff could be useful to include in those different tiers in terms of the storage, having the original paper copies and the secure long-term storage, but then having digital backups of maybe you scan those pictures of your parents and store them in the cloud, or those stories that they've told and things like that. We're actually going through right now with my parents, and we did this with my wife's parents as well. There's a company called Storyworth, and what they do is you gift this to your parents. It sends them an email once a week with a prompt, right? A question like, what do you remember most about your childhood or your mom or dad? And they write and document their upbringing and what they're most proud of and the challenges that they faced and things that you might not normally talk about with your parents. And just to help document that for the next generation. And so you have that copy that you can think back and they get a copy of it as well and things like that. So think about if you want to document some of those unwritten stories and family legacies that aren't in the form of a will or, some of these legal documents we've been talking about.
No, you said it, Matt. And, this gets close to everybody's heart. And it's something that we recently had a meeting with the NAR organization. And I was surprised by when we went around the table and everybody was introducing themselves, how many people that this was a family story about owning minerals more than it was anything else. And there's pride that comes with that. An ancestor has built something, they've left something that's enriched the future generations. And it's a beautiful story. And minerals are just a part of that. But like you said, there's so much more to it. And we value it and sometimes don't pay enough attention till it's gone.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a good place, I think, to wrap up here. And just I think the whole moral of the story here is the proper document storage for these estate planning documents isn't just about organizing them and communicating them to your family. It's really about caring for your family's future. It's an act of love and service to educate them. I know it's a difficult conversation, to recognize our mortality and to talk about these things, but it can mean so much to your family to know that you care enough that you've done all this work to help make their lives easier when you're gone. And so I think that's the key takeaway here is, you want to leave these assets better than you found them, right? So if you had the struggles of trying to figure out what you owned and how to manage them, and you went through all the work of educating yourself and finding these documents, don't let that go to waste, right? Pass that on to the next generation. And so that's the key takeaway here. And we'll link in the show notes to a couple different episodes here. We have one that was about important documents for minerals and royalties. That was episode 34. And then again, episode 85, talking about probate and marketable title with Richard Winblad, who's an Oklahoma-based attorney. And then also I have the cheat sheet that you can download in the show notes. There'll be a link there, and you can get access to this checklist to help you with your estate planning and helping to communicate this to the next generation. So thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you in the next episode. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.